want to thank some people. First, my editor at Type Investigations, which was until very recently called the Investigative Fund, Esther Kaplan. You know, this is a story about the US Coast Guard, which until recently, or actually until today, if people watch the news, generally only got good news. We sort of think of the Coast Guard as a branch of the military that saves fishermen off of Montauk. And so when I went to pitch a story that I had dug up about abusive detention practices that the Coast Guard was engaging in, Esther listened to me, which I found I really appreciated, and then really stood behind this story and supported it until, as we do at Type Investigations, we brought it to the New York Times Magazine. And I want to thank my editor there, Claire Gutierrez, who's brilliant and who really saw this story through with me until it was published. I also want to thank and mention Kristen Nelson and Joan Weber at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, because after I did an investigation, which I'll talk a little bit about, into the Coast Guard's drug war detention practices, it turned out that the Canadian Navy was part of the sort of human rights abuses that I had uncovered, and so I collaborated with them at the CBC to do a follow-up last year. In late 2016, I was on the phone with a defense attorney, a federal public defender, who I talked to often, who's a source of mine, and I talked to her every few months just as a way of kind of keeping up with what's happening in the federal courts, and she told me that she had a case come in that seemed to her to be rather strange, that flew in the face of things that she thought she understood about the criminal justice system, and involved an Ecuadorian man who was being charged with maritime drug smuggling under a law called the Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act. And he'd been picked up in the Pacific Ocean, a couple thousand miles away from the nearest US port, and brought to, in that case, San Diego, to be prosecuted for drug smuggling. And what he had told her, his defense attorney, was that he'd been held before he arrived in court for a month on board Coast Guard ships, and he didn't know where he was going to be taken, and nobody knew where he was. And the defense attorney, I think, was kind of like, no, that's not true. It turned out that it was true, and as I began to sort of look into what she told me, I started finding that there were hundreds of cases of people who had been prosecuted under this law, this maritime drug law that makes it a crime in the United States to be found with drugs aboard a boat anywhere in international waters. And I wrote many of these men letters in federal prisons in the US, and they started writing back to me, dozens and dozens of these rather long letters, some of which included, a few of which included drawings, hand drawings of the boats where they had been held. And I began to talk with these men, interviewing them inside of federal prisons and visiting some who'd been deported to Ecuador and to Colombia. And they told a story that later was corroborated by a number of Coast Guard officials of a system of maritime detention where suspected drug smugglers who are picked up thousands of miles from the United States are being held aboard American Coast Guard cutters, often outside, exposed to rain and hot sun, and shackled to the decks of ships, and they're left there, carried around the Pacific or the Caribbean as these boats travel around, picking up more smugglers, finding more people who are suspected of smuggling drugs, until it's time to bring a load of these men back to the United States. And so then they're brought to Panama and flown to the US, or delivered to Guantanamo Bay and flown to the US. And while they're on board, they say that they, and these Coast Guard officials have now confirmed, they're not provided phone calls, their families don't know where they are. In some cases that I reported in the story for the Times, families have held funerals for their loved ones, thinking quite reasonably that these men who went to sea, either their families knew or didn't know that they were smuggling drugs, had died in the ocean. We're in a moment globally right now when in the United States and Europe, there's this sort of really intense effort to push borders outward, to deal with problems and anxieties about the nation far away from our borders. And when that happens, and we exert this sort of might of our legal power, the protections that we expect will accrue inside of the borders don't carry with that exertion, that geographic reach. And so we have a situation right now where every year hundreds and hundreds of people are being detained in this way, and the sort of baseline protections of the criminal justice system don't follow. And so, this story, I hope, has shed some light on that kind of silent part of the American criminal justice system. And unfortunately, it appears that it's ongoing. I got a letter not so long ago from another man who was held like this. So I suppose I should keep reporting on it. But I'm really happy to be here with all of you, and excited to hear about the other stories. So thank you.